Hi, good morning, and I hope you all had a comfortable night and a good night's sleep, and you enjoyed the evening yesterday. It was a informal opener, but I think it was an interesting conversation. Gave you some of you who've traveled from outside India would have got a flavor of some of the debates that we are engaging with at this moment. Let me first this morning invite Professor Jim McGann to say a few words. He's the person who's been for the last close to a decade now working hard on creating a global think tank ranking and creating, more importantly, a global community of think tanks. I think he's someone who lives on a plane. Each time I try to set up a teleconference with him, it's in a different time zone, but we were able to pull this off after I think 1.5 years, and we look forward to doing this every year now. So let me first invite Jim to say a few words to all of us.
Samir, thank you very much. Welcome to everyone from throughout India and around the world. I first want to provide a heartfelt thanks to our host and co-organizers, the Observer Research Foundation and its leadership and staff that have stuck with this through thick and thin to make this event in India and to bring together the think tank community in India, a annual event which I think is both in all of the institutions here and I would say in the national interest of India to keep the momentum of this going forward. I'd also like to thank the McKinsey Global Institute and its work both in India and globally for agreeing to partner and co-host this event. In each one of these summits, in every region of the world, and there now have been 26. So there are regional summits and global summits, and it is an effort to create a global community of think tanks. But in this context, in terms of India, and what I'm focusing on is how to sustain this effort at the national, regional, and global level. And as a part of that, there was the support for this summit of a planning committee that included partners, and the effort was to make sure that, and one of the key comments at the last summit was that the institutions and analysis was Delhi-centric, and so in each one of these there was an effort to make sure that think tanks from across this continent and country are represented, and their interests and needs are represented in these discussions. And so I want to thank Gateway House, Brookings India, the Hindu Center, the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, Takashila Institute, IDFC Institute, the Center for Internet and Society, Carnegie India, Delhi Policy Group, Chennai Center for China Studies, and the Integrated Research and Action for Development Center. So the intent is broadly representative in terms of throughout India and in terms of both domestic and foreign policy, and is with their help that we shaped the program that we will be discussing today and the issues we will be discussing today. As I said, since now for, I'm reticent to admit that I have spent my entire career focused on think tanks, but in the last 10 years, concerned about the future of think tanks, the sustainability of think tanks, and this effort, this meeting, and the regional and global meetings are designed to sort of create a global community of think tanks where the challenges and The more I travel, it is clear that the challenges that you face in India are challenges shared by think tanks in other regions and countries. There are clearly, which we will discuss, unique challenges in India. The second major objective is to raise the profile of think tanks, not only nationally and regionally, but globally, and to underscore the important value added and contribution they make to the policy making process, but more importantly, in serving the public. It is my hope, and you have before you recommendations from the last summit, and that these meetings will serve as a catalyst for ideas, innovation within the think tank community in India, but also globally. I want to read a statement, and this will be my final comment, that was fashioned by one of our partners when we launched the meetings in May of 2015, which was the inaugural meeting. India's, and these are not my words, but our partners, India's ambitious growth agenda requires the support of homegrown, independent institutions which can incubate ideas to give the country a competitive edge, a concept the West has understood and used to full potential for over a century, with think tanks and policy research institutes providing critical input and topical expertise. India is among the top 5 countries in the world with the largest number of think tanks and policy research institutes. This is reflective of the intellectual power of the country and presents an opportunity for the government as well as the private sector to benefit from the expertise of such institutions and to support them robustly. The recommendations you have before us, or before you, are really came out of the meeting, came out of the institutions, many of which are here again today. And the question is, can we move those? Can this meeting, can this group serve as a catalyst for moving some or many of those recommendations forward? There is, in all of these meetings, and from my standpoint, a power in the collective voice of this group, and which can serve as a catalyst for both innovation and action that will support the institutions that are here and improve public policy for the public and the people in the country of India. So thank you very much. I appreciate your all coming, and I appreciate the partners and planning committee have helped make this possible.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for your efforts over the past decade to create a more robust community. Let me invite the leadership of McKinsey Institute, another co-organizer, co-host, and partner, Anu, to say a few words to all of us this morning.
I think it's on, yeah. Thanks, Samir. A very good morning to everyone. My name is Anu Madgavkar, and I'm a partner with the McKinsey Global Institute. I'm joined this morning by my colleague Subhajoy Sengupta, who's sitting at the other end of the table, who's a McKinsey partner as well, and will join us in one of the panels over the course of lunch today. For those who may not know the McKinsey Global Institute and what we do, we are the economics and business research arm of McKinsey and Company. We work on long-term structural issues which pertain to economics and business shifts, largely in areas such as urbanization, technology, innovation, productivity, competitiveness, and growth. And we are wholly funded by McKinsey and Company, but our work is in the public domain. We very much look forward to gatherings like this, and we're actually delighted to help and support gatherings like this because we feel we learn a lot from the community of other active think tanks. We gain perspectives in terms of what people are working on in areas that might be different. We like to absorb that as feedback and input to the issues that we are thinking about. And we also learn a lot in terms of how to convene, how to engage stakeholders, and so forth. I think we've had wonderful leadership for this particular event from both Jim and Samir, and really look forward to being part of this and making this a continuing community which can coalesce around perhaps an annual event, but nevertheless be connected and engage with each other over a period of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Anu. Now I'm going to request Anu to hop over to the other end where she will join the panel. But as she does that, let me conclude this particular segment with 3 or 4 thoughts. And I don't have too much to say because Mr. Joshi gave quite an expansive address yesterday on the role of think tanks and why we are here. But let me just reiterate 4 points made by him, Jim and Anu. The first, I think, no sector in the world has grown without deep intersectoral linkages. So if we are the knowledge sector, then we need to create knowledge value chains. Unless all of us work together, the sector will be fragile. I think by coming together, by working together, by creating bilateral and plurilateral partnerships here, we are in a sense strengthening the depth of the sector. So I think knowledge value chains is the way forward. No single institute can be the repository of all knowledge, but we must source talent, resources, and other platforms to further many of our research agendas. So I think that's the first reason why we are here. The second, I think we also must understand that in like any other sector or business, we are competing. There is an issue of scale, there is an issue of size. And unless we can coalesce more force behind certain narratives, we are unlikely to be heard sufficiently in certain parts of the world, maybe sometimes even in our own country. So we need scale, size, and speed, and sometimes each of us can help each other in attaining those. The third, I think this is extremely important. We must start reimagining India beyond its political boundaries. As India undergoes its own federal experiment and more money is allocated to states and they become more independent in decision making, we are in a sense seeing, instead of a union of India, now an Indian union, where we will have to bring together sometimes deeply divergent voices on key economic and political questions. And unless we can have a cross-India span of this community, we sometimes may not be addressing what many others do believe to be options and pathways that are sensible. So I think reimagining India from within is important. Seeing it as a union of 30 odd different political units is crucial if we need to come up with certain outcomes that respond to the largest segment of the population. And finally, reimagining India's role in the world. And here I would say that we as an institute are encouraging our researchers to start engaging, studying, and producing work around questions that may not necessarily have India as an interlocutor or as a protagonist. It is equally important for India to be commenting on other parts of the world which will impact its future growth and the stability of its future political and economic stability. And I think we are seeing some of it emerge from Indian think tanks, but more of it is needed. And perhaps here again, due to the diverse talent sets that are available in different institutions, we could find common ground for working on regions which currently may not be as attractive as, say, reporting on our neighborhood or on the Indian Ocean region. So these are some of the thoughts I wanted to share with you. Let me turn it over now to Mr. Alok Bansal, who leads a nifty Indian think tank, the India Foundation. And over to you, sir.
Thank you, Samir. I think with this we begin the first session, which is Globalization 2.0, Managing the Transition and the Tensions. Well, Globalization 2.0, how is it different from Globalization 1.0? And I think that's the very question. And there are different versions, there are different statements. But whichever way we look at it, primacy and centrality of China in Globalization 2.0 cannot be denied. And consequently, Chinese thinkers, many of them have tried to make it as palliative as is feasible as far as the Globalization 2.0 is concerned. And as one of the important Chinese thinkers, Eric Lee, said that Globalization 2.0 is the interdependence of plural identities instead of the old Western-dominated Globalization 1.0, which assumed the universality of one global culture, thereby indicating that in the Globalization 1.0, it was the Western world which tried to promote its own culture and values across the globe. and tried to homogenize the world. Whereas I think globalization 2.0 takes into account the heterogeneity of the world and trying to bring some sort of an approach. Having said that, there are no doubts that there are huge impediments to globalization 2.0. There are various political issues. In fact, in India itself, yesterday we had huge discussions on OBOR or Belt and Road Initiative, as you may like to say, which is of course one of the very key ingredients of the so-called globalization 2.0. Of course, at this point of time, how successful it would be or it would not be, because yesterday evening we kept debating whether this initiative will see the light of the day or will not see the light of the day. People debated whether history repeats itself or history doesn't repeat itself. I wouldn't go into those details because we could discuss whether history repeats or history doesn't repeat till cows come home. But the fact is that there are huge imponderables, and I think nothing bigger than the current US presidency, because I don't think so there is anybody within this hall who can definitively say which way is the Trump presidency going to go, what is going to be the next action. And now that actually raises questions whether it's this sort of a administrative setup, is it an impediment to globalization 2.0 or it is facilitating? Because one of the key ingredients of globalization 2.0 is shift of power from the West to China. And I think with this sort of a knee-jerk reactions, you might probably be facilitating that sort of a shift faster. I'm not an expert, so I shouldn't take much time. And we have 4 experts who would be enlightening you on this particular subject. And first of it is, of course, Professor Harsh Pant, who is a distinguished fellow from Observer Research Foundation. He's, of course, well known in the academic circuit. He's written extensively. Over to you, Harsh.
Thank you, Alok, and thanks to the organizers for having me here today. I think this is, I'm part of a panel that says the session is titled Globalization 2.0. I'll start by by making a slightly different argument that, whether we, I think Alok pointed out certain features of Globalization 2.0. May I just question whether this is Globalization 2.0 at all? Because scholars of globalization would tell you that we have seen multiple ways in which globalization, or what we know as globalization, the way it has manifested itself over the years. So I don't think globalization 2.0, for example, reveals anything deep, or if we say it's globalization 2.0, it means anything in that sense, in the larger historical sense. What basically I think what we are trying to say is that we are entering a new phase of globalization, and we really are not sure what the contours of that phase are going to be. Now, if we go back and if we just take the post-Second World War historiography, then I think what we are looking at is our 3 basic phases, and the 3rd phase into which we seem to have entered. Now the first phase, and I think this is important to recollect here, because the linkages are quite categorical, and those linkages tell us something very fundamental about the way global politics is emerging and the way global politics is likely to shape up. So if you think of post-Second World War international order and how American-led Western liberal norms dominated that global order, and how that led to an emergence of a global order that has laid the foundations of what we know as contemporary globalization. So in that sense, the modern manifestation of globalization is an extension of what was laid, the foundations of which were laid post Second World War. And this was underwritten by the emergence of an internationalist America. And I think Alok pointed out the turbulence that we are witnessing today. But the turbulence is a reflection of the fact that we have gotten used to an America that has been an internationalist one since the Second World War. And I think, therefore, this dissonance between what Trump administration says today and what America has traditionally done, at least since the end of the Second World War, makes us a bit uncomfortable. Because our fundamental assumptions about global politics are predicated on this argument that America is going to take this role of a global leader, and therefore certain problems around the world will be solved by America as the hegemon. So I think that the first phase of that was primarily an American-led, Western-led, global order institutions were laid down, and normative order was framed around largely the Western hemisphere, so around largely the West. And so when the Cold War ended, and when Francis Fukuyama said it's the end of history, what basically was happening was that the argument that globalization basically reflected the interests of a certain part of the world was now being taken to other parts of the world where policymakers were diffident about adopting globalization. So the entry of China and India into the global mainstream since the 1990s meant that the complexion of globalization also changed. These were massive continental countries that were entering economic transformation. And that economic transformation basically meant that over a long period of time, something fundamental will change in the balance of power, and that seems to have happened. Now, I think a lot of the domestic turmoil in the West is largely a reflection of the fact that globalization, or that the forces of globalization that were unleashed then had changed the balance of power within these countries and amongst these countries, so between the West and the East. And as Alok pointed out, this shift that we talk about from the West to the East is again a manifestation of that fact. So now today, as we enter a new phase where we are talking of America's seeming retreat from global arena, we are a bit uncomfortable because we are not used to it, and there are new sorts of pulls and pressures on the global mainstream. And we are now facing a paradoxical situation where those who till the other day were tentative about the benefits of globalization are now its greatest champions. So you have the Chinese and the Russians arguing that, look, globalization is so important, we need to preserve it. And this is a very interesting contrast, because I think this in a way shows how effective America's policy has been, that it has converted those who were perhaps the fag end of the line. And so when today Marxists are complaining that America is retreating, something fundamentally is changing in global politics. And I think that perhaps is an understanding that we need to start off when we are looking at how international politics is being redefined, and how the challenge that countries are facing in virtually every part of the world is a reflection of our getting used to certain trends in global politics, and when they are shifting, we are uncomfortable, including the Marxists. What we have instead is now an alternative argument that is being made, and Alok alluded to it, that China is making an argument about an alternative global order. Now, clearly, if we look at the structural realities today, it is well positioned to make that argument. It is materially well endowed. It is trying to create an institutional infrastructure. So on three aspects, it is there. It is almost there. But I think what it lacks is a basic normative argument. And I think this idea that somehow Chinese argument for one belt, one road is basically a hidden agenda behind its hegemonistic transformation, is basically a reflection of an argument that we have long heard. This argument about Chinese military spending, for example. This idea that Chinese spend so much on the military and we don't really know anything about it. So and the idea that what are the Chinese up to? This lack of transparency in the Chinese political system makes a lot of the countries in the region and beyond very uncomfortable. Something that was not the case perhaps with the Americans, and therefore the comfort that countries had with the American-led globalization is missing today when we talk of Chinese taking the lead in defining the contours of globalization 2.0 or 3.0, as I would call it. So I think when you're looking at that prism where you have a relative decline of the global hegemon, and an argument being made by an emerging power that, look, I can take its position, what is the role for India? And how can India position itself as a country that has traditionally not taken a role as a leading power in global politics? The arguments that India has framed about its own role in global politics have largely been defined by what many Indian thinkers have called bridging power. We have bridged so many parts of the world that I think today we find ourselves lost in terms of just whether we do have the bridging capacity or not, because the argument at one point in time was that we are a bridge between East and the West, we are a bridge between developed and developing countries, we are a bridge between North and South. But I think what has happened in India today is something very fundamental as well, that now India as a nation is beginning to talk of itself as a leading power. And I think that change in idiom is self-reflected of a new sense of confidence that India has. And it comes at a time when the global political architecture is changing. So where does India situate itself in that mix? And I think today, perhaps that idiom of leading power, that idiom of a leading power comes because India feels confident about its own material capabilities, about its own liberal democratic ethos, and also I think at some level its ability to be at peace with multiple contradictions. And I think that is important in a world which is contradicting itself at every hour. So we are now living in a situation where the Chinese are the greatest exemplars of economic globalization. So certainly India itself can be positioning itself as a leading player in that matrix, where America's decline and China's nascent arguments about its own global role perhaps pivots India into a situation where India starts making an argument which is more substantive than it has made in the past, more substantive than merely a non-aligned power, or more substantive than merely a bridging power. And I think those of us who are in the academic world and who are in the think tank business would like to then think of the possibilities that brings to the table, not only for India, but also for the international community as it engages with India. And it tries to look beyond just the Sino-US binary. And I think there India's position is becoming more interesting, I would say, compared to past, and India's ability and the desire of Indian policymakers to play that role is becoming more manifest. So I would just conclude by saying that in this age of Mr. Trump, deglobalization, and fourth industrial revolution, when the certitudes of the past are no longer with us, India's role inevitably has to be a bigger one. I think not only to preserve its own equities in the international system, in the international environment, but also to a great extent to stabilize an international order that is passing through a very turbulent phase, partly because we really don't understand what is happening and where it is going. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh. I think thanks a lot for sticking to time. And I think one of the very important factors which he talked of, that despite all the opacity that surrounds China's military spending, I think nobody doubts that it is still lesser than US. But still, we look at US as a benign power and China with concern. And I think that stems from the democratic credentials of US. I think it's the people who are the key in US, whereas in China, you are not very certain who's actually the key, who could take the decision, and whether the popular perception in any case would drive that. Having said that, next speaker is Dr. Francois Nicolas, Senior Economist and Director, Center for Asian Studies, French Institute of International Relations. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. We'd like to start by thanking the organizers for having me here and giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on Globalization 2.0, 3.0. I don't know exactly which category of globalization. So let me provide you with my own take on globalization. Well, being an economist, of course, I tend to be a bit biased and I suppose a bit narrow-minded. But my vision of globalization is really an economic vision. So from my perspective, globalization is really about economics first, but then, of course, with a number of geopolitical implications. So let me provide my understanding of my vision of the evolution over time, and you will see that there are some overlappings with what has been previously presented, but on some other points, I guess we tend to disagree, which is good for the discussion. So the way I see things, well, globalization 2.0, if this is the word or the phrase that we use, is characterized, first of all, by the rise of new powers. So we have been seeing the rise of a number of new economic powers over the past few years or few decades. Well, actually, this is not all that new. The rise of economic powers has been observed as early as the late 1970s. So this is not really new. So how come that we pay so much attention to this rise? Well, the reason is that recently, so over the past decade or so, these new powers are much bigger. So this time around, things are different because of the size of these rising powers. And together with the size, the larger size of these economic powers, comes also their ability as well as their willingness to play a role or to have more of a say in global governance. So that is a difference. If you see the rise of a country or an economy like Singapore, of course it's not the same thing as when a big country like China rises. It makes a big difference. So even if economic rise has been observed for a long time, the new thing is size, ability, and willingness to have more of a say in global governance and to play perhaps a role similar to the role that had been played by traditional powers. So that's my first point. And globalization is really characterized by the rise of big powers. The second point I want to make is that we tend, I guess, today to overplay President Trump's election. And a number of people tend to argue that President Trump's election was a turning point, was a watershed moment. And I would argue differently. I think that a watershed moment has nothing to do with Trump, but it has something to do with the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. This was really a turning point. But this is a time when precisely the rising powers, in particular China, realized that the traditional existing powers were not all that powerful, that they had some weaknesses, that they had some vulnerabilities. And so it was a very good moment for them to precisely show their willingness to play more of a role. They had at that time the capabilities, in particular the economic and financial capabilities, to do something, plus they saw a perfect opportunity to fill a void since the traditional powers were getting slightly weaker, so to speak. So I see the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009 as really a turning point, a watershed moment in recent history. So as a result, these rising powers, and of course in particular China, so it's an excellent opportunity to do something. Of course now with President Trump's election, we see an additional component, an additional factor, and so the US is officially retreating to some extent from the front stage. But this trend was already in place. This is nothing really new. The election simply reinforces or strengthens the trend, which had been in place for ever since 2008, 2009. So this is the state of play today. Rising powers, retreating powers. Does that mean that we will have the replacement of traditional powers by newcomers? And I think this is something that was said yesterday, and I fully agree with that. The answer to this question is no. We won't be seeing a country like China simply replacing the US. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first reason is that the US is simply perhaps retreating, but it's not declining. Plus, President Trump's election may be the sign of a stronger retreat or a more clear retreat, but President Trump is not there forever, hopefully. So I guess that a number of people take it for granted that this is the beginning of a new trend, but I think this is not the case. So it may be simply a short moment in US history. Let's hope so. But I do think that it will be a short moment in US history. So there may be less of a role played by the US. The US may no longer be the hegemon it used to be, but it doesn't mean that the US will totally disappear from the stage. That's the first thing. Second thing, China is not in a position to replace the US for reasons that were highlighted before. I mean, China doesn't have the same soft power. It does have some soft power. It is trying to push its soft power, which is not that soft, actually. But it doesn't have the same kind of soft power as the US. So it does not promote the values, for instance, that the US and the West altogether have been promoting ever since the end of World War II. So it is in a very different situation. It is not in the same position as the US and the West altogether were after the war. So the conclusion of all these various changes is that my guess is that the new world that we are living on will be a world of, well, will be a multipolar world with a multiplicity of poles and a multiplicity of possible alliances. So depending on the topic that you look at, there will be coalitions or alliances between various countries. And these alliances will not be the same depending on the topic. If you look at, well, if you take the case of climate change, for instance, on the climate change issue, what we see is more similarities between the EU, China, India to some extent, with the US being on the side. In other areas, like the trade issue, for instance, even though the EU and the US do not see eye to eye on trade issues these days, I think there are still more similarities between the EU and the US than between the EU and China. This is for sure. So in this kind of issues, we see a different alliance as the one we see on climate change. And this is the case for a number of issues. Depending on what we look at, what we discuss, some countries will team up, join together, and try to push a vision, and some others will be sidelined. And on some other issues, the arrangements will be different. And this is what we'll be seeing in the future, I guess. So it is a much more complex world with multi-layered kind of possible governance, which makes things complicated, which may make things hopeful for think tanks, because it provides us with a number of things to explain. So that's good for our business. But of course, it makes the world also more, well, dangerous perhaps not, but more unstable. Because depending on where the alliances play out, you will have, instability coming with it. So I guess I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Francois. I think for ushering us into a more complex world. Which is the turning point, I think, whether the global financial crisis or Trump presidency, I think a bit of both. Probably first expose the global community to the chinks in Western armor, whereas second, expose the global order to its vulnerability to decisions taken by American administration. So I think to some extent both of them. Our next speaker is Anu Madgavkar, partner McKinsey Global Institute, who has been doing musical chairs since morning. So over to you.
Thanks, Alok. Feels nice to be sitting in one place. But I think we've had a very sort of elegant and robust articulation of the global landscape of shifting power and evolution of that really in terms of the various phases. And as Francois has rightly pointed out, a debate around what is indeed the watershed moment and the way forward. So with that context, I think what I would like to do is really tee up some thoughts in terms of implications for an economy or a country like India, which, depending on which way you look at it, is already or is aspiring to be a leading player in this shifting power landscape. And how do you really think about, what will it take for India to play its rightful share? And I would submit that even before we get to a sort of geopolitical role for India, the underlying or the underpinning enablers of what makes for a global power or regional power are two sort of economic elements. Without two solid economic elements of global relevance and global leadership, to debate what the political outcomes or stance of a country like India could be, becomes almost theoretical. So if you come back to the two economic underpinnings, I would argue that the first of these is what one might call global economic relevance, which, as Francois said, is very much around size and scale. But beyond size and scale, it's also about productivity and growth. And I would use for that as a proxy this whole notion of global connectivity. So if you think about the world economic order or economic system as a series of flows, how much of these flows are we as a country really able to capture and intermediate based on being productive and competitive in intermediating those flows? As you think about these flows, they are sort of goods, services, finance, people, and increasingly a fifth, which is less regarded as a global flow, but rapidly increasing share, which is really all about data and information. So these are the 5 global flows, and there is one set of questions around who's really winning the race, if you can call it a race. Maybe maybe a lot of people are winning the race, but are we really winning the race in capturing a bigger share of those global flows? The second element of global relevance and global sort of political power, I would believe, is a solid base of domestic political support or citizen support, or something that gives the state the ability to pursue a set of global strategic engagements with the stability that comes from having that core base. Now, that base of political power and stability domestically can be achieved through multiple means, and different countries and systems have actually done so. There are a set of choices and implications for India. So before sort of delving into each of these, I think the overarching argument I'm really making is that it's in India's best interest to really think hard about what can it do to deliver against both these axes, and from there derive sort of a more strategic share of power in this shifting landscape that's been described. If you think about the first of these, which is really the global flows piece of it, goods, services, finance, people accounted for something like roughly 25% of global GDP back in, I think it was back in 1990. And that actually rose to its peak just before the global financial crisis to almost 55% of global GDP, and now has come down to about 40%. So the 55 to 40 is what a lot of people see as stalled globalization, which is goods, services, and finance as a share of GDP really seeming to flatten and taper out. What, of course, that's masking is the fact that data and information is just exploding in terms of cross-border flows, risen 45 to 50 times in the space of 10 years. Roughly half of all service exports around the world are in digitized form today. Roughly 15% of all global trade in goods is actually off e-commerce platforms. So there is a strong element of global competitiveness to capture flows that just comes from being able to be part of the digital global economy, which is something I feel that's less understood but will become increasingly relevant in the coming decades as you think about a global economic superpower. If you think about where India stacks up in this race for global connectivity along all these 5 dimensions, it's pretty clear that there are other countries which are running as hard or harder than us. If you think about the US and China, both of these, by our measures, would rank within the top 5 global economies in terms of their global connectivity scores across all 5. And China has dramatically increased or improved its position in terms of this global connectivity ranking from the mid-20s to number 7 over a 2 to 3 year period. And India is more or less at around 30. So I would say that there is a lot of work in process there for us in the coming 5 to 10 years in order for us to ramp up and play this role in the evolving global political order. The second dimension was really, what does this mean for citizens, and is there a base of political support that allows the state to engage more dynamically and more strategically overseas as well? And this is where the notion of the watershed around the global financial crisis is absolutely true. Trump is an extreme manifestation of it. It's so in your face that nobody can miss it. But if you look at what has really happened to income distribution in many, many advanced economies, perhaps not all, but many advanced economies, since, and even I would say before the global financial crisis, because of underlying structural trends around technology and globalization to some extent, what we find is that the broad middle class, which can be as much as 60 to 70% of income cohorts, households by income cohort, the broad middle class, not the very top and maybe not the very bottom, but the broad middle class, 60 to 70% of these cohorts have actually seen flat or declining incomes for the last 10 years or so. So the implicit social contract, which was very much part of the way people grew up in the post-Second World War era, which is that we will be better off in future than we are today. Our children will be better off than our parents' generation was. That implicit belief has been severely challenged by structural forces combined with the GFC, which actually stripped aside a lot of the stuff that was covering some of these forces. And this is what has, is shifting the stance of many leaders, Trump at one extreme. You may argue that the France election is a sort of redeeming feature, that it hasn't really gone that extreme way. But nevertheless, there is this sort of retreat or reconsideration, because again, the research might show you that that households that actually have been in this flat or falling income category for a prolonged period of time have the most negative views about both global trade as well as immigration. So in response, leaders are bound to shift, and therefore this apparent retreat or stalling of globalization from a political standpoint in the advanced economies. China is actually going through its own challenges in terms of its own citizen engagement, as we know, and many would argue that a landing, a hard or a soft landing at 6% growth or 5.5% growth, if that were really to materialize for China, that would mean that the tremendous contributions that it has made by lifting 700 million people out of poverty in the last 2 decades suddenly is not sufficient, and citizens in China start wanting more, leading to its own tensions and transitions. But China's response seems to be one around saying, how do we really manage the transition from a very investment-led economy with low return on capital to one which is more innovation and productivity-led. And that's kind of the transition that's going to be vital for China if it's to retain maybe not its only place, but one of 2 or 3 leading economies in this new world order. And in that context, I would say India's challenge is really, India's done a moderately good job of raising people out of abject poverty, certainly not sufficient, but moderately good. I think India's big challenge is this whole notion of the 50%, the bottom half, which lacks many aspects of a decent minimum acceptable standard of living. And the path forward to India, we would argue the numbers would suggest around half of that upliftment of people depends on more productive work opportunities for people, and about half of it actually depends on better supply side innovation to get basic services across to people in a much more low cost and affordable way. That's a big set of domestic challenges, and without addressing those challenges, India's own ability to be that world leader in the next 10 to 20 years would be challenged. So let me just stop here. There are lots of solution spaces one can enter, but this is how I would frame the sort of priorities for India.
Thanks, Anu. I think you got a roadmap for India. And of course, connectivity is the key. That's what China has been saying. And our final speaker of this panel is Sybil Rhodes, who is from Centro para la Apertura y el Desarrollo de América Latina. So over to you. I really don't understand Spanish, so maybe my pronunciation is flawed, but over to you.
No, that was very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the organizers and particularly to the Observer Research Foundation for bringing me here from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I should let you know I am an immigrant in Argentina. I was born up north. I am a Yankee, as they say in Argentina, but I've lived there for 11 years now. So, but that explains the name and the American accent. I thought that I would speak about South America and Globalization 2.0 or whatever we want to call it. I'm going to speak about South America instead of just Argentina, in part because it's more interesting and in part because it's more comparable to India to speak about South America than just any single country. I should start off saying, well, how can I speak of South America as a unit? Is it even a region, a geopolitical region in any sense? And I think that I have 2 answers for that. Yes, it is. It depends on ideas. And there are 2 contrasting ideas about South American unity. One we could call populism and one we could call liberalism to really oversimplify things. But really the more important answer about whether South America is a region, in my view, and I'm a political scientist, so this might not be surprising, but if Brazil wants it to be a region, then it is. Because Brazil is simply so big. So South America is 12 countries and 3 territories compared with India. But I would say that in spite of these greater geopolitical or greater political divisions, there's still a higher level of cultural homogeneity in South America than there is in India. And this is my first visit here. I'm not in any way an India specialist, but I certainly am aware and can appreciate the great diversity here in this country. I think that South America also, although it has always had a difficulty with economic integration because its patterns of trade have tended to be with developed countries and other parts of the world, still the level of social integration, linguistic integration, things we might almost call natural, are very strong. So that's my justification for comparing South America with India. South America is only 6% of the world population, whereas India, I understand, is almost 20%. So that's a big difference, even though South America has more territory, about 12% of the world's land, while India has about 2.5%. And neighborhood and location are also very different. India, as I've been hearing yesterday and today, is at the heart of the New Asia century. And South America is removed, stuck in the Western Hemisphere, as Henry Kissinger allegedly once said about about Argentina. Though some people say he said it about Chile too. He could have been saying it about all of South America. He called it a dagger pointing straight at Antarctica. I think the dilemma for South American countries and South America as a region in Globalization 2.0 is, well, how to participate. How to participate economically and, of course, politically, given these factors that I've mentioned about its neighborhood and history, and the things that it can't change. South America has a strong historical and political ties to the West, and particularly to the United States. I think it was very significant earlier this year whenever I would give talks about what's going on and explaining Trump. The sorts of, earlier this year I kept on saying, well, look at the participation of Latin American countries, and particularly South American countries, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There was an important component, Latin America was an important component in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. And Latin America or South America were not specifically included in any of the Chinese-led initiatives, at least not formally. Although that seems to have been changing very, very recently. So I think perhaps China has realized, China and South American leaders have realized this problem and are doing something about it. But still, for a long time, in spite of all of the tensions, South America has considered itself part of the West, part of the Western Hemisphere. With China, even though it wasn't formally involved in these initiatives, as I said, of course, trade with China has been important. Chinese investment has been incredibly important, and in numerous South American countries. There is the example of Venezuela being unable to repay its loans to China. Some other regional cases like that were mentioned yesterday. So China, the Asian century or Globalization 2.0 or whatever it is, has arrived to South America, but a little less so, I guess. Now, just to round up, I thought I would talk about, well, how have previous changes in the international system affected South America? Previous changes in polarity. As we all know, during the Cold War, the US did not hesitate to intervene actively, to bully, to undermine governments in its own hemisphere. with the end of the Cold War, with the end of bipolarity, South America became more democratic, and the US became more respectful. Not that it still didn't try to influence, but it allowed itself to be contained much more fully in regional institutions. I think we can see this even now, even with all of the confusion in the Trump administration, who still haven't appointed too many of their Latin American advisors and mostly seem to be confused. Trump has very recently changed Cuba policy, but he's pretty much followed what President Obama did with regard to Venezuela, where, as I mentioned, there is a severe humanitarian, economic, and political crisis. And the Trump administration is basically supporting a regional approach. This regional approach is made difficult by the fact that Brazil is in a crisis of its own, of a lesser severity, but still very important. And it doesn't look like Argentina and other countries are willing to play a strong leadership role without that support of Brazil. So Venezuela is definitely up in the air. But returning to the general discussion of, well, what happened in South America as a result of previous changes in polarity? When it became more democratic, institutions were used more, and it also became more peaceful. The arms race between Argentina and Brazil was ended, and for several decades now, there's been a tremendous amount of nuclear cooperation between these two former nuclear program rivals. So the previous system change, in my view, was overall very positive for South America. It's a little bit harder to know how it can best take advantage of this new change. I think even if it is united, South America is going to be less capable than India, say, of offering any sort of counterweights against other powers. It is in the neighborhood it is with the history it has. So does this make it harder or easier to benefit from the new Asia century? I think the positive view is that perhaps it's easier for South America to stay out of political entanglements, but it can still benefit economically. And just to conclude, I would say that I think in South America there's plenty of room for more interaction with India. There are some shared values of democracy, tolerance, and pluralism. And I think perhaps that with these interactions, it provides an opportunity for scholars and think tanks to reevaluate the relative weight of ideational variables, that is the role of ideas in global politics versus those pure power politics. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sibyl. I think if there is one part of the globe which Indians are generally unaware of, it's, I think, the South America, and you have done a wonderful job of enlightening us. And I think what is important is what you said about cultural homogeneity, which is far more than India. I think another factor which we often, I think, overlook is that the countries of South America share common icons. People like Simon Bolivar, I think he would be considered an icon in many countries of South America. And I think we have a road here in the heart of Delhi. Since it's your first visit, you could go and see that particular road. But I don't think so in Asia you would find that sort of common icons which are actually revered across national boundaries. So we have heard 4 speakers, and I think they have given their own viewpoints, whether globalization has retreated, stalled, or transformed. It is for all of you to decide, and I can see the first hand already, Samir. I mean, just take one other.
So just a couple of short points. I think most of the speakers spoke about the difference in the American led effort in the 20th century and now a Chinese proposition. I think one central feature, and these are not my words, this is something that Ashley Tellis spoke about. He said America allowed a form of penetrative democracy, which meant global actors could penetrate their democracy. They could come and lobby for certain issues in their Capitol Hill, they could create various lobbies. And although America was the hegemon, it allowed a democratic process to arrive at global decisions, and its own pluralism, which was penetrated, created that belief that you had recourse. I think that's something that China has to create, that format. If it has to be a globally acceptable actor, what will be the Chinese model of accepting various viewpoints and including them in their arrangement? I think that's one part which is important to know. The second, I think, was fantastic. Normally, Anu, your intervention was excellent. I think there are, Harsh and the others alluded to possibly there being three models of, three stages of globalization or three phases of globalization. One being the Cold War itself and how two zones of influence created global institutions, all the non-proliferation arrangements, arms control treaties, and the rules in space, seas, oceans, etc. However imperfect they were born out of these interaction between these two zones of influence. The second was the unipolar world post the collapse of the wall and the Soviet Union, and you had American-led 15 years till the global financial crisis, and thereafter now you have the third model. But I think you have described it in three stages. I think the first stage of globalization was about globalization of power and peace to keep the world stable, and you had the two big players distributing and redistributing political power around the world. The second was economic globalization, which was largely American-led during the unipolar moment, and American institutions, American banks, American companies took the good word around the world. And you have said the third phase of globalization is actually data globalization. And if you look at the numbers, and I think it's a World Economic Forum report, while the trade of goods and services and financial flows have not necessarily increased in the last 5 to 7 years, data flows are showing exponential growth. So maybe value is embedded in those data flows, and therefore the Chinese proposition to be a front runner in capturing these flows is of considerable note. And I think we don't take it seriously that perhaps in a couple of years it will be the Chinese who will be proposing data globalization, unlike the current situation where there seems to be hesitancy in accepting free flow of data by the Chinese. They may flip their argument at the time when they are ready to dominate global flows, and I think we must keep track of that. And the final point I want to make is that whether it's normative or real, the normative attraction or the real attraction to someone's proposition, I think what is most important is institutions. And we are in a world which we have never been in before. Global institutions have never worked in multipolarity. So we can keep striving and being in love with multipolarity, but we have never had a world which has made institutions that have worked in multipolarity. They have either been institutions that have worked with two superpowers or with one superpower. Having 7 to 8 distributed centers of power is not necessarily something we have experienced before. I'm not saying it won't work, but I'm saying that the whole arrangement through which institutions will now be managed will have to be recrafted. And I don't think enough attention is being paid to keep these flailing and failing institutions alive. And I think that's the point that maybe I just want to leave with the panelists to consider. Thank you.
General Chopra.
Thank you.
If everyone could introduce themselves, since we have, and their affiliates.
I'm General Chopra. I spoke yesterday also. I'm a combat veteran involved in think tanks from Washington to Beijing. Okay. Yesterday we spoke about the non-aligned movement, and Pinaku sitting there demolished it. So we talked of NAM 2.0, and today, this morning, we're talking about globalization, or as I say, GL 2.0. Yeah, sure, there is global uncertainty in the world, despite somebody saying the world is complex. There is some deglobalization, there is protectionism, and the new mantra seems to be make in the country, make in America, make in India, and so on. My question really is that all this activity that's happening in the globe, what is the impact on Asia, largest population, largest growth of economy? How does it affect Asia? And specifically, since we are talking about India, what about India, where we are talking of look east, act east actually, and somewhat even looking towards the west, where we are veering somewhat towards multipolarity, and as Samir says, perhaps that is not quite happening because of the institutions. So is the answer, I'm looking for an answer, is it more importance to the regions, regionalism, and as Alok says, leadership by India? We've got China there also. And finally, now that there is digitalization, trade through digitalization, does globalization or deglobalization matter in today's world? Thank you, Chairman.
I'll request everyone to introduce themselves, I think, before asking the question.
Thank you. My name is Suresh Goel, retired ambassador. My remark is actually based on the remark made by both Francois and Anu about how this whole process of the transition to multipolarity or the break came. I'm basing my question very briefly on my experience in the United Nations, where I was there from 1991 to 95 as member of the Indian delegation to the United Nations. And I remember the intensive discussions we used to have to defend us against the risks of a unipolar world that was likely to happen with the end of the Cold War and USA becoming the primary power. And we used to call that not multipolarity, but democratization of power, which we wanted to be reflected in the Security Council, UNGA, across the world. And if you recall at that time, anybody who has worked with the international systems, Europe was basically with the US to strengthen that unipole, add to the strength of the USA to work. While the other developing countries, non-aligned movement, etc., in G77, they were struggling to keep their own balance, their own location, space in the changing world. Came 2000, Security Council reforms, etc., we all know about that. Came 2008, and that is where I entirely agree with you. Came 2008, and the situation changed. Europe began to look for space away from US. Europe began to look for space away from US, because they knew that the US economy, being what it is, may not be able to really come with the European Union the way it was there before. Chinese came in to fill the gap. We all know about Chiang Mai initiative, currencies supporting the currencies. The whole situation changed. Multipolarity came, but not in the form of democratization of power, but in the form of another power filling in the space which was being created by the retreat of the USA. What we forget is that Europe's affiliations also changed directions. Europe began to look at China more as kind of a partner than it was doing before. My question now really is that the Chinese initiative of BRI, whatever you call it, which actually they call globalization of power, but is actually creating a China-centered world in the form of creating another hegemon, is putting up the walls in Europe again. Germany, France, etc., they're questioning what actually it could lead to. My question really is, in this changing scenario, not as Europe, but say the major European countries, France, Germany, etc., where India and they have a common interest in ensuring a true multipolarity where one country does not occupy the space and become a hegemon. Can the alliance or can a collaboration, which nobody has spoken about, between India and Europe be the solution? Thank you.
Ugo Trambali, ISPI, Italy. I have a question for Anu. How can the opacity of the political system in China can live together with its tremendous connectivity? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I think 4 excellent presentations. There's one element of globalization that perhaps we have not focused adequately on, because I think, as Francois said, there is the economic aspect, and Harsh talked about the normative aspect. But there is also the element of providing a certain global public good. And I would say that that is the rule-based institutions order. So if you look at the US or West-led period, you find on the economic side the role of the dollar, which is critical. You find in terms of rule-based institutions, yes, they had their, anachronisms in terms of the vetoes of Security Council or whatever, or voting rights in the IMF, which, because of a certain inertia, have not changed. But nonetheless, there was a rule-based international order. And then there was the normative aspect of it, of free markets, human rights, democracies, etc., etc. But if you look at China, I mean, the OBOR or BRI can probably be approximated, in a sense, to something like a global good, as it were, in terms of infrastructure. The finance, the role of the RMB is still far, far less as compared to the dollar. China is trying to make efforts to increase the role of the RMB in terms of its trade, in terms of the AIIB and all the rest of it. The normative, certainly, China backs away from it. In fact, because China did not approve of the normative approach, so therefore China says that and that is something which perhaps some countries have found appealing, but it's something that it has shied away. Now, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Does having a normative approach make it more appealing in a ideological sense, or does not having a normative approach make it more appealing? I think it's a bit early to say. But finally, the other important thing with regard to this particular kind of globalization that if we want to still call it that, is that in the case of the US or Western-led, the enemy was an ideologically described enemy, namely the Soviet Union, and it was far away. When China tries to do this, it is doing it in a region where it has outstanding disputes, boundary disputes, maritime disputes, etc., etc. Yes, with countries that are much smaller in some ways, not as they don't have as large militaries as China has or as large economies, but nonetheless they are sovereign states. And so therefore it ends rubbing up with its assertiveness, because it can't but help that, because that is taking place in its own region. And so whether it is India, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Japan, whether it is Philippines earlier and so on, there are tensions, Taiwan and all the rest of it. So I think this is, and finally the point that Samir made, that because of the lack of normative appeal and a lack of institutional frameworks that exist in this region, you have problems. And the old institutions, because of the inertia, are unable to reform themselves at the pace at which they would be able to deal with this challenge. So in some senses, it is not globalization, it's very, very different kind of, we need to find another label for it perhaps, because there are strong elements of fragmentation here.
Thank you, sir. Now, I think rule-based institutions is again a debatable point, and we have a lot of hens going up. But before I take a further round of questions, I'll request, I think, panelists if they would like to respond, if any of them, starting from reverse. Any issue that you would like to respond?
No, I would just say that I think the question of public goods is very important.
Mike?
Oh, yes, excuse me. The question of infrastructure and public goods and who exactly the public goods are for, if that is what they are, is something that we should keep debating. I'll stop there because most of the questions were about South America.
I think there were some really excellent comments and questions both. Just a response to a couple of them. I think the first was really around, is there more importance to regionalism? Is there a space for India and the EU, for example, or Europe to forge stronger links? At the risk of a fairly simplistic answer, I would tend to believe, I would like to hark back to, I think, some of the comments made by Nitin Pai in yesterday's dinner panel, right, where he described the potential space as a swing power, in which we can choose to engage on topics or issues based on our own strategic interest without being a consolidated part of any region or any bloc or any formation. There were pushbacks from people saying that, is that viewed as opportunistic? And perhaps it might be, But I think when the rest of the multipolar world has large chunks which are clearly on the opportunistic side of the spectrum, I think to be a swing power with some bedrock of being constructive, right, and being sort of on the stronger on the soft power is probably not a bad space to occupy, and we should certainly look for opportunities like that in Europe. I think just one more very specific question around, can China's political system coexist with greater connectivity going forward? I think that's a great question, and I wish I had the answer. What I can say is that if you reflect on China's history, and I'm not going back to the Middle Kingdom, but even the more recent past, there have been tremendous transformations as well in the past. So the largest movement of people from rural to urban areas, universal rural compulsory education up to secondary. I mean, there has been tremendous transformative forces which might have provoked the same question. Can these be consistent with the political system as it is? And I almost wonder whether global connectivity, even of the 2.0 or 3.0 version, is posing a challenge which is fundamentally more. I wonder, I think that would be a fair question to wonder. And I also think it does come back to the notion of the social contract. So what is it that the Chinese people believe, and if the economy and jobs and work and incomes actually move up that value curve as China hopes that it will and delivers against the expectations of people, I would say that there is space for the current system to continue, I would argue. But I have no clear answer to that bit of crystal ball gazing.
Yeah, perhaps answers to two questions. Well, the one about the potential cooperation between India and Europe. Well, I fully subscribe to what has just been said. And this goes back to what I was trying to explain. Perhaps I was not clear enough. Depending on the topic, and there may be some topics on which India and Europe, or the European Union to be more precise, have a common vision and have common interests, and in which case they can certainly cooperate. Of course, this may not be true for all topics. And this is precisely what I was trying to explain. There will be a multiple layers of possible governance. So on some topics, India and the EU may be cooperating, and some others, they may not be exactly on the same page, in which case, well, there won't be any possibility. But so I think that there definitely are possibilities for further cooperation between the two regions if ever they have common vision and common interest. The second is about the Belt and Road Initiative as being a global public good or something of this kind. Well, this is what the Chinese want to sell. And I guess they have a point, and to some extent it can certainly be seen as a public good. The problem is that so far it's not exactly the way it looks. So far it's really it's a Chinese initiative serving Chinese interests primarily. So theoretically, it could be a public good, but for the time being, that's not exactly the way it is. So yeah, in theory, yes, but in reality, no. That would be my view.
I think most of the issues have been covered, but I'll just touch upon two aspects. One is multipolarity and one is institutions, and I'm a political scientist. So I've never really understood why multipolarity, and Indian diplomats are sitting here, I mean, why was it such a big deal? I mean, multipolarity, actually, if you think about it in historical terms, has never been good for the international system. So I think either we were being, I think all of us were being hypocritical, and foreign policy is about hypocrisy. So I think, to go to on global platforms, to go on global platforms and say we love multipolarity, I think I'm sure we know what we were talking about, but I think.
Basically want democracy, but
yes. So I think the question then is, it's interesting to hear now concerns being expressed about global public order and how America's role. I think if you just go 2 decades back, we would be having very different conversations about why is America being so internationalist? Why is it going around in the world and poking its nose in other people's affairs? And now we are concerned that America is not doing that, that China is now doing that. So I think that is primarily a reflection of international politics as it is being played out. And partly, I think, India's own role in it and India's attempt to find a place for itself, which is, I think, which all nations do. And therefore, the point that I was trying to make earlier on is that we are now in a phase where those assumptions have been appended. So once those assumptions are no longer with us, then we need to find a different role for ourselves. And therefore, whether we want to be non-aligned or not, whether we want to be a bridging power or not, whether we want to be a leading power or not, the critical questions for us is, do we understand the international political system as it is evolving? And my sense is that most of us do not, because most of us are not sure whether, as I think Francois pointed out, whether the Trump is a phenomena, is a transitory phenomena, or whether there's something fundamental changing in Western societies. Or whether the Chinese model of economic development is something that is going to happen consistently over the next few years, and the BRI model is something that people are going to buy into. So I think we need to be a bit more circumspect about certain of these conceptual issues which we tend to use, but which also tend to have some very different connotations. Similarly, institutions. I think institutions reflect great power politics at every level. We have seen institutions taking very, very stances that have been quite at odds with the global public order at times. UN Security Council has voted on a number of issues at times which have not been reflective of the global public order that UN Security Council is supposed to deliver. So I think institutions, the trouble I think for India is that what happens if China becomes the dominant actor deciding the terms of the discourse? And I think that the consequences would be much more troubling for our diplomats than they have been when America was deciding those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. I think before we take the next round of questions, just a small request. We have a large number of people willing to ask questions or make comments. Please be brief because the time is limited. And lest I be accused of leftward biases, I think let me start from the right. At the end, yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm Nachiket. I'm a researcher from IDSA. I would just want to ask one question to the lady from McKinsey Global Institute. You talked about flows. What about the new manufacturing technologies like artificial intelligence, 3D manufacturing? What will be the impact on global supply chains? Do you think global supply chains will get shorter? And the reason why I'm asking you this is that the Chinese model of growth of bringing so many people out of poverty has been by linking to these larger global supply chains. So do you think global supply chains will also go in some sort of transition?
Over the last couple of days, or last day, there's been questions and a focus on economics, but in terms of, and I'm putting on my hat as a professor of international relations and not Mr. Think Tank, but it is a mix of economics, military, and diplomatic and political elements that contribute to emerging or established powers and how they sustain, and the fact that these are both dynamic and relative. And then in terms of what Samir said, and I would be curious in terms of the panel, these issues of soft power, of which I think India has a number of significant elements, one in terms of a democratic and open system, English in terms of the pervasiveness of it, connectivity, the ease of doing business, critical thinking and analysis, well-developed STEM, a well-developed higher education system, and specifically in terms of Samir's comment, a tolerance for penetration and criticism, and these elements not reflective in the Chinese system. So it seems to me that in terms of relative, and that these are critical and important elements of the emerging dimension of power within India, which I don't always see fully realized or articulated within India itself. And I think those, are, if I see anything, the most distinguishing and important aspects within the Indian context. And then one question for our colleague from Latin America. I mean, the really interesting dimension in terms of Latin America and this relative comparison is that, which you did not mention, is that that Latin America shares a common language, history, and culture, and icons, as was mentioned, but the unique dimension is that it is totally absent of interstate conflict. And so the puzzle is, why isn't Latin America more of an economic or regional or global superpower? Certainly we can blame the US, but I don't think that the blame entirely is on the US.
Thank you, Chair. So far, I think we have discussed a number of issues. I like to start with Harsh's and Jim's, restatement of the problems that we are facing for discussion. Globalization too, whether it is temporary or what kind of character it has, it is real for sure. It has challenges. It has created new difficulties in terms of following the old model. Even the Chinese realized much before Trump's coming that there is need to rebalance its own strategy, economics-wise and otherwise also. So that rebalancing act, changing partnership, changing relationships, changing equations, and changing political relations, international political relations, is now name of the game, which is very difficult to concisely figure out. And that's why we need experts which are gathered here at a think tank forum. Samir, I think you have done very well to put the focus, and I like the participants as well as panelists and the chair to put little more attention than has been given. In fact, not much attention has been given to each aspect of the potential and power of national, regional, and global partnerships. We have done global levels quite a bit, but I think national, for example, the new challenges will be finding out new partners within the country how to make progress, further progress. For example, one aspect is new forms of private-public partnerships. Another new idea would be changing the institutions in terms of skilling, development, linking with globe, where the services, for example, for India, can find some space without too much objections from national protectionist policies. In other words, where you can give examples of creation of jobs rather than taking away of jobs. I'm being brief because there are three dimensions which one has to tackle. Regional, for example. If United States is
Sir, if you
leading
could
PPP,
restrict to the session, please, because the theme of the forum could go on, but we are dealing with globalization 2.0.
Yes, exactly. This is within the same framework. I'm only going to do that. For example, now if there is a changing TPP without USA, which leaders is there space for others to join in? It's a relevant question, for example. And finally, on this particular global institutions themselves, WTO is in retreat. International institutions need to be structured. United Nations need to be restructured. It's true that it's a theme which is beyond, one particular session. But some thought will have to be given in this session. We will be very grateful if you can give us what kind of scenarios are emerging which are practical and which are not. Thank you so much.
Hi, Cleo Pascal from Chatham House. I have a follow-up question to the European Union foreign policy in the context of globalization question, and in particular, the foreign policies of individual European states in a post-Brexit world. France, as we know, is a maritime power. It has territories in every major ocean, the second largest EEZ on the planet. And we've seen incredible jump in activity of France in the Pacific, especially after the $40 billion submarine sale to Australia. And the question is, what is the trajectory of France's foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific? And what is that trajectory, especially in the context of EU foreign policy in the region?
Thank you. My name is Martha and I'm interning at the URF. I have a question for the panel based about India. We talked about India being a rational swing actor in this multipolar world. I would like to know if the fact that India is so emotionally involved in conflicts with its neighbors, if that emotional conflict involvement could be bad for India's swinging rationally. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Madhu Bhalla, formerly Delhi University, now editor India Quarterly at the ICWA, Indian Council for World Affairs. I really have a question for Anu. First of all, I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed your analysis of the structures of globalization that have emerged since in the neoliberal globalization period. I'm just wondering, considering that we are really entering the fourth industrial revolution technological period, what are the likely structures, economic structures, going to be, and how will states respond to that? We've seen states responding to, in a sort of backlash to what happened in the 1990s, the movement of manufacturing to other markets, et cetera, et cetera. And secondly, for those states who are still struggling with the present phase of globalization, catching up to the present phase of globalization, is there a possibility for leapfrogging the last aspects of the present globalization directly into the fourth industrial revolution stage? Thank you.
Yeah, just looking at the entire range of discussion, what comes out is the fundamentals have not changed when it comes to transition or turbulations or whatever you want to call it. The point is that depending on what means, what structures, what infrastructure, what institutions were available, nations have worked towards achieving their own goals. We heard this resonating with the America First or Make in India over here. BRI has been mentioned by so many people over here. Obviously, China is looking at China first. So it's a question for nations now in this process of transition to see how they can use existing means, structures, and whatever else there is to see that they get the best for their own population. This morning I saw this news about F-16s likely to be made over here. I'm opposed to it personally. And professionally also, I think there are enough arguments against this because the last time it was produced in America was 1999. But there are these things that are, work in progress kind of a thing where India has to decide what's good for you. You can't make it in India by importing the entire assembly line from USA. So I think we continue to look at the digital world which is there, world without walls, and the social media which has become very active. And I'm sure in the next sessions we are going to look at what is the role of think tanks in the changing environment which will enable this process of globalization. So I think that is what we need to be conscious of, to say that the fundamentals have not changed, but what we have available today for making those decisions have changed. So let's make use of them in a more concrete manner so that we are able to deliver for our own nations. That was my point.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Geeta Madhavan from Chennai, President of ILSAI. I just have first I'd like to thank the panel because economics is not my area of expertise, so I have learned a lot. So thank you for the wonderful presentations. And therefore, because it's not my area, I'm going to ask you to indulge me. I've been listening to a lot of things, but there's a small niggling question in my mind. Anybody on the panel can answer this. Can someone tell me what would be the role of Russia, a robust Russia, in the coming 10 years in the area of globalization? I mean, nobody is talking about it. It's just being pushed. I think defense, globalization. Personally, I think there is a role that's going to emerge. But can someone enlighten me in case I'm wrong or whatever? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I had raised my hand, but I thought of withdrawing, but I was not sure whether I should bring this discourse down from the sublime to the mundane. One thing I find missing in the discourse is the sort of not looking at a different globalization that's taking place today, which cuts across everything. It's not state-sponsored, it's not state-driven, it's not hegemon-driven. The US drove its globalization quite secure and insular in the fact that it was separated from the world by 2 seas. If China is aspiring, or if Russia comes down the line, or if India comes further down, they will not have that luxury. They will be adjacent to other powers. They will have to recalibrate them to be able to drive that. But what we see today is something quite phenomenal and quite different. One of the panelists mentioned about the economic meltdown of 2008, 2009. And I recall a smaller meltdown 10 years earlier in the US, which did affect the global economy also. The globalization that I see today is being driven across the world by an age group which has probably been shaped not a little by these two meltdowns. Youth between 18 and 35, and if you take longevity today, I would extend that youth age to 40. It's an insurgency, a global insurgency against the perception of institutions established after 1945. So that was, if globalization first was 1.0 was post-45, then you had 1.25 and 1.5, etc. But it's still a pushback against that, which ranges across the world from South Korea to Brazil to Venezuela and back. And I think all of us need to be looking at that more seriously, because even though different triggers have different stimuli have triggered off these insurgencies, they are all essentially share the same casus belli, the institutions which they perceive to have failed them. So I would like the panels and other discussants to comment on this.
Thank you. I'm Nicola Misaglia from ISPI. I have one question for Anu Madgavkar. You concluded by saying that India has a whole set of domestic massive challenges to address in order for the state also to play a more, let's say, a bigger role on a regional and global level in order to intercept flows and all this. I would like to know which solutions you propose and if some solutions are being addressed right now. Another short question for Dr. Nicola. So you predict, and actually I agree with that, that the world is shifting towards coalition and alliances of various countries on specific topics. Does this mean we are actually shifting away from a true international global governance and value-based governance towards more transactional and utilitaristic kinds of alliances? And in this world, how to set any kind of standard in global governance? I mean, this could be that the most powerful alliances will simply impose themselves. I'm not saying this hasn't happened until now, but what does the future reserve?
Thank you. I think we have grossly run out of time. So I'll just request the panelists to respond. You need not respond to all the questions or comments. We have a tea break after this, where comments could be discussed threadbare. But 30 seconds each to all four panelists. We wind up. Just make your salient points, starting with.
Yes, incomplete, quick answer about the question about Russia. I think Russia is the face of a new form of interference in elections. And I think that's something that think tanks could follow. To answer the question about South America, Latin America, and peace, I think the cause and why is the fact that that it lacks interstate wars not helped it become an economic superpower. The causes of peace and democracy are different from the causes of economic growth. I think it's a great blessing for Latin America that it is peaceful and democratic. As for why it's not as big an economic superpower as it should be, I'm not an economist, but I will say that it needs better infrastructure and also the patterns of trade have not helped it. I don't know if that was 30 seconds.
30 seconds is a very harsh stipulation by our chair, but let me take a quick stab. First, I think the point made by the ambassador around individuals counting is a really important point, and I think it's fundamental to part of this whole transformation, which is digitally led. Whether you think about individuals connecting, whether you think about small SMEs, micro enterprises even suddenly acquiring the scale to be global actors and players, whether you think about a world of the future where actually cities and the mayors who lead those cities are actually the global agents of change as opposed to traditional national state formations. There are many, many of these sub-national, micro and individualistic forces at play, which might make the world of the future very different. So thanks for bringing that up. And the last 10 seconds maybe, on a bunch of questions around the impact of technology. I think it's definitely true that global supply chains are shortening as an outcome of automation perhaps, but I would like to put a positive opportunity-led spin on this. China, for example, there are provinces in China which have set themselves a target that says by 2020, 80% of my manufacturing will actually be automated, right? Because the productivity benefit of that is actually very high, and the confidence that you can upskill your workforce is also very high. I think in that context, the leapfrogging opportunity, and India is the best example of a country that can and must leapfrog, not having a manufacturing base, much of a base to start with. But I think part of this is going to be how we use automation and digital platforms to create new work opportunities for people, whether in manufacturing or services. There are lots and lots of such opportunities, but that's what I would say.
All right, I'll try to be brief as well. So one answer to the question on the trajectory of French foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific. Well, despite the name of my institution, I'm not coming from government, so I have no clue what the government wants to do. My analysis is that the French government will go exactly in the same direction as the previous one. So you may remember the last time at the Shangri-La Dialogue, France announced, or the French Minister of Defense announced that there would be freedom of navigation operations conducted by France. And so, and they have done it. And I guess that they will go on exactly in the same way. So the Asia-Pacific is definitely an interesting and an important region for France, and I see no reason why there should be a change in the foreign policy. But this is just a personal take and personal guess. I have no clue what the current president will do, but the first signs point definitely in this direction. Just one quick answer to a question about new institutions. What should be done in this new context of globalization? How should institutions adapt? So I will just give one very concrete example, since this is what was asked for, to be concrete. I guess that in the trade area, for instance, I don't think that the WTO is fully dead, maybe in some kind of a coma, but it's not really dead. And it's the reason why it's not dead, it still serves some purposes. And in particular, the WTO is the place where plurilateral agreements may be discussed. So these are agreements that do not encompass all countries. So all countries are not participating. Only those countries interested in the topic may be participating. And the WTO is still providing a forum to discuss these kind of things. And I guess that we will see more of this in the future. So not fully multilateral agreements, including all countries in the world, but plurilateral agreements, including only the countries that are interested in a specific topic. So I guess that may be one way, one direction for evolution of existing institutions.
Very briefly,
just one more second. So I'll keep the discussion about a transactional, etc. Issue over tea.
Yeah, I can also handle all the questions at the tea break if you have any, but I'll just like to end with an assertion, a bit of a provocative one, but I think something to think about. That whether we talk of technology, whether we talk of data, whether we talk of global supply chains, I think just like in the past, the future of globalization will be determined by the politics at the national, regional, and global levels. And I think that is something that we need to bear in mind as we talk of all the technological and economic material factors through the course of the day. Thank you.
I think I'd like to thank all my panelists for sticking to the time frame, and I think Samir has an announcement to make before we break for tea.
Yeah, so first join me in applauding the panel and the chair for this.